She arrived in a sapphire silk dress with $40,000 hidden in her trunk and introduced herself as a carpenter's daughter. He was a scarred, bitter man standing in the ashes of everything he had ever loved. She needed to disappear. He needed a reason to keep building. But what happens when the woman holding the secret that could save everything is the same woman whose truth could destroy it all? And when the moment of reckoning finally comes, she doesn't spend the fortune. She burns it. This story teaches us that the greatest wealth we can ever possess isn't locked in a trunk. It's built with our own hands, brick by brick, truth by truth, alongside someone worthy of the fire. Welcome to a channel where the dust of the Old West carries the weight of real love. If this story moves something in you, drop a comment telling us what you would have done with the $40,000. Share this with someone who loves a good frontier tale, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you, and it burns just as bright.
The stagecoach didn't just leave, it fled. Clara Thorne stood on the hardpan of West Texas, her gloved fingers clutching the handle of a heavy leather trunk that felt more like an anchor than a suitcase. Behind her, the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the rattle of the coach faded into a suffocating silence, swallowed by a horizon so flat it felt like the edge of the world. The dust kicked up by the wheels lingered in the stagnant air, a fine, alkaline powder that tasted of salt and ancient desperation. She was 26, dressed in a traveling suit of sapphire silk that had seemed elegant in Boston but now looked like a cruel joke against the landscape. The sun was an unrelenting eye peering through the haze of a heat shimmer that turned the distant mesas into liquid ghosts. Clara took a breath, expecting the scent of sage or the dry promise of the frontier. Instead, the air hit her lungs like a physical blow. It was thick with the acrid stench of wet ash, scorched cedar, and the metallic tang of old smoke. She turned toward what was supposed to be her future. The letters from Caleb Vance had described a modest but sturdy cabin with a wraparound porch and a kitchen garden already blooming with squash. What Clara saw instead were teeth, blackened timber frames jutting at odd angles against the pale sky. The roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a scatter of charred boards across earth that was still obsidian dark from the flames. Only the stone chimney remained whole, rising from the wreckage like a tombstone marking the grave of someone's hope. The 300 yards between the trail and the ruins felt like a mile. As Clara took her first step, a sound shattered the silence. Crack! It was a sharp, final report of a Winchester rifle. The noise echoed off the hollow shell of the barn, sent a flock of crows screaming into the sky, and then vanished, leaving the world even quieter than before. Clara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a cage of sapphire silk. Was this Elias? Had her cousin's hired guns found her already? Her hand instinctively moved toward the hem of her skirt, where a small, silver-plated derringer was tucked into a hidden pocket. But then a figure emerged from the shadow of the weathered barn. He was tall, lean in the way of a man who worked until he forgot to eat, and his movements were stiff, as if his very bones were weary. He carried the rifle in one hand, the barrel still smoking. He didn't look at Clara. Instead, he looked down at something behind the barn. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, before he finally turned his gaze toward the trail. This was not the man from the tintype. Caleb Vance had been a boy with an easy smile and eyes full of light. The man walking toward her now looked as though he had been carved out of the same charred wood as the house. As he drew closer, the sun caught the left side of his face. Clara's breath hitched, but she forced herself not to recoil. From his temple down to his jaw, the skin was a map of puckered, shiny silver, old burn scars that had pulled the corner of his eye and his mouth into a permanent, hard-edged grimace. It was a face built for war, not for a wedding. "The coach isn't coming back for 3 weeks," the man said. His voice was a low growl, like gravel being ground over iron. "I am aware," Clara replied. She drew herself up, summoning the poise of a thorn, even though that name was the very thing she was running from. I'm looking for Mr. Caleb Vance. We had an arrangement. The man stopped 10 feet away. His right eye, a piercing icy blue, scanned her from her expensive hat to the tips of her dust-covered boots. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a flickering resentment. "Arrangements change," he said. He gestured with the barrel of the rifle toward the blackened ruins. "The fire took the house 6 weeks ago. It took the livestock, the winter stores, and the man who wrote those letters." Clara felt the world tilt. "What?" "Caleb was my brother," the man said, his jaw tightening. "He died in that barn trying to save the horses. The shot you just heard? That was the last mare. Her lungs were scorched in the fire, and she finally gave out. I did her a mercy." He stepped closer, the smell of gunpowder and old smoke rolling off him. "I'm Silas Vance. And you, Miss Thorne, are a catastrophe I can't afford. There's no house, no husband, and no food to spare for a city girl who looks like she's never held anything heavier than a tea saucer. You should have stayed on the coach." Silas watched the woman. He expected her to faint. He expected her to wail or demand he find a way to get her to the nearest town. He had dealt with her kind before. Fragile things that broke the moment the frontier showed its teeth. But Clara Thorne didn't break. She looked at the ruins of the cabin, then at the barn, and finally she looked him straight in the scarred eye. Beneath the sapphire silk and the refined tilt of her chin, Silas saw something flicker. It wasn't just shock. It was the look of a person who had already stared into the abyss and found it familiar. "I can't go back," she said quietly. "Everyone says that until the first rattlesnake crawls into their bed," Silas retorted. "You don't understand, Mr. Vance. I didn't come here because I was desperate for a husband. I came here because I needed to disappear. And while I'm sorry for your loss, truly sorry, I have a legal contract and a proxy marriage certificate signed by your brother's hand. By the law of this state, I have a claim to half of whatever is left of this land." Silas let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Land? Look around you, lady. This isn't land. It's a graveyard. I've got $70 in my pocket and a pile of ash. Your claim is a ticket to a slow death by starvation." Clara stepped forward, dragging the heavy trunk through the soot. "Then we had better start digging." "Digging for what?" "For a future." She dropped the handle of the trunk, and it hit the earth with a heavy metallic thud that seemed far too substantial for a lady's luggage. Clasped within that trunk, sewn into the lining of her quilts and hidden beneath a false bottom of cedar wood, was $40,000 in gold certificates and U.S. Treasury notes. It was a fortune that could buy every acre from here to the Rio Grande. But as she looked at Silas Vance, at the bitter curve of his mouth and the way he gripped his rifle as if it were his only friend, she knew that money was her greatest danger. If Silas knew she was rich, he would either resent her as a savior or see her as a mark. If the town knew, the word would travel back to Boston faster than a prairie fire. She had to be a seamstress. She had to be a worker. She had to be someone Silas Vance needed, not someone he could use. "I am a carpenter's daughter, Mr. Vance," she lied, her voice hardening with a third layer of steel she had kept hidden from the drawing rooms of Boston. "My father taught me how to use a spirit level and a crosscut saw before I could sew a hem. You need a house. I need a name that isn't the one I was born with. I'll help you frame that cabin, and in return, you'll give me the protection of your roof and your silence." Silas studied her. He saw the sweat beading on her upper lip and the way her hands trembled slightly, but he also saw the stubborn set of her jaw. He looked at the barn, the only thing he had left. "The tack room has a door that locks," Silas said eventually, his voice weary. "There's an old stove in there and a cot. It's better than the dirt, but not much. If you're still here when the sun comes up, I'll give you a hammer. But I don't provide for anyone, Miss Thorne. You pull your weight, or you go hungry." "Agreed," Clara said. She turned to look at the sunset. The sky was bleeding a deep, bruised purple, and the wind was picking up, whispering through the charred ribs of the homestead. She was a fugitive, a liar, and a bride to a ghost. But as she looked at Silas Vance's scarred silhouette against the dying light, Clara realized she wasn't just running from Elias anymore. She was running toward something she couldn't yet name. The gunshot had been the end of Silas's mercy. For Clara, it was the opening bell. She walked toward the barn, her sapphire silk dragging in the soot, leaving a trail of blue through the black. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Because somewhere in the darkness behind them, the ghosts of Boston were coming, and she had 3 weeks to build a fortress out of ash. The Texas dawn didn't break. It bled across the horizon in a bruised palette of violet and ochre. Inside the barn's tack room, the air was stale, smelling of oiled leather and the lingering scent of damp ash that seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of the world. Clara woke not to the gentle chimes of a Boston mantel clock, but to the rhythmic, metallic clink-clink-clink of a sharpening stone against an axe. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed. The cot was a thin strip of canvas over a wooden frame, providing as much comfort as a rock. She sat up, her sapphire silk dress, now hopelessly wrinkled and stained with soot, feeling like a costume from a play she no longer performed in. She opened her leather trunk. The gold certificates remained hidden beneath the false cedar bottom, silent and heavy. She reached past them, pulling out a bundle wrapped in coarse brown paper. Back in Boston, she had told the shopkeeper she was buying sturdy gardening attire. In reality, she had been preparing for a frontier she hoped never to see. 10 minutes later, Clara stepped out of the barn. Silas Vance stood by a grindstone, his back to her. He had stripped down to a sweat-stained undershirt that clung to the powerful corded muscles of his shoulders. He didn't turn, but his movement stilled. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an observation of a stubborn fact. "I told you I would be." Silas turned, and for the first time his icy blue eye widened. The catastrophe in sapphire was gone. In her place stood a woman in heavy duck canvas trousers tucked into sturdy leather boots, a tan work shirt cinched at the waist by a wide belt, and her hair, that crown of chestnut silk, braided tightly and pinned against her skull. "You look like a boy," Silas grunted, though his gaze lingered a second too long on the curve of her jaw. "I look like a worker, Mr. Vance. Now, where is that hammer you promised?" Silas threw a heavy, rusted framing hammer into the dirt at her feet. "Chimney's the only thing standing. We clear the charred floorboards first. If the stone foundation is cracked from the heat, we're done before we start. I don't build on sand, and I don't build on broken rock." The work was a descent into a private purgatory. By noon, the sun was a white-hot hammer. Clara's hands, once kept soft by expensive salves, were raw. The soot turned to a black paste against her skin as she hauled armloads of blackened timber to the salvage pile. Silas worked with a silent, terrifying intensity, using a pry bar to rip up floorboards that groaned like dying animals. He didn't offer her water. He didn't offer her a break. He was waiting for the snap, the moment she would drop the hammer and beg to be taken to the nearest railhead. Instead, Clara found a rhythm. Every time her muscles screamed, she thought of Elias Thorne's face, the way his eyes had gleamed when he told her he'd have her committed to an asylum if she didn't sign over the inheritance. She thought of the hired men he had undoubtedly sent to track her. She swung the hammer. Thack! She pried a nail, groan. "You're holding it wrong," Silas's voice rasped. He appeared behind her, a shadow cast in scorched earth. Before she could protest, he reached around her. His chest brushed her shoulder, a sudden jarring heat that made the breath catch in her throat. His hands, calloused and scarred, covered hers on the hammer's handle. "Don't fight the tool, Miss Thorne. Let the weight do the work. If you grip it that tight, your wrist will be useless by sundown." For a heartbeat, they were dangerously close. She could smell the salt of his skin, the wood smoke in his hair, and the underlying scent of a man who had lived too long in the company of ghosts. His breath stirred the stray hairs at her temple. Then he jerked back as if he had been burned again. "Check the well," he snapped, his voice harsher than before. "The pump's acting up. If we don't have water, we don't have a life. And if you can't fix a simple leather valve, you'd best start walking east while you still have the light." Clara watched him walk away, his gait uneven, the scars on his face shimmering in the heat. He was a man who used anger like a shield, and for the first time, Clara wondered what lay behind it. She went to the well. She didn't tell him she had never seen a pump valve in her life. She simply took her father's old toolkit from the trunk, sat in the dirt, and began to dismantle the iron casing. She had $40,000, but in this moment, a functioning leather gasket was worth more than all the gold in Boston. She worked until her fingernails were chipped and her knuckles bled. But when the first gush of clear, cold water finally spilled from the spout, Clara let out a laugh that rang across the empty plains. Silas, standing atop a charred beam, paused. He looked at her, covered in grease, soaked in well water, and smiling like she had conquered a kingdom. He didn't smile back, but he didn't tell her to leave either. He simply picked up a timber and kept building. By the fourth day, the tack room agreement had become a silent, grueling routine. They shared a breakfast of hardtack and bitter coffee, worked until their shadows disappeared beneath their feet, and collapsed into their respective corners of the barn as the coyotes began their nightly lament. Silas was a man of few words, and most of them were sharp. Yet Clara noticed the small things. She noticed how he always ensured the barn door was barred twice at night. She noticed how he left the freshest bucket of water near her door. But she also saw the pain he tried to hide. The fire hadn't just scarred his face, it had crippled his left side. When the wind kicked up or the temperature shifted, he moved with a hitch, his left hand clenching into a useless claw. That afternoon, they were attempting to move a massive half-charred support beam that had pinned a section of the stone hearth. "On 3, Silas grunted, his face pale with exertion. 1, 2, 3. They heaved. The beam shifted, but Silas's boot slipped on a patch of loose ash. He went down hard on one knee, a muffled cry of agony escaping his lips as his left arm buckled. "Silas!" Clara dropped her end and scrambled over the debris. "Get back!" he hissed, his eyes squeezed shut, his face contorted. "I don't need your pity." "It isn't pity, you stubborn man. It's physics. You're hurt." She reached for his arm, but he flinched away. "Don't touch it. It's the fire. Sometimes the heat comes back, even when there's no flame." Clara didn't listen. She had seen her mother nurse sailors back from the brink in Boston's harbor district. She reached into her toolkit, not for a wrench, but for a small, leather-bound apothecary case she had hidden among her father's saws. She pulled out a jar of willow bark salve and a tin of peppermint oil. "Sit," she commanded. It was the voice of the woman who had managed a boarding house, the woman who had stared down Elias Thorne. Surprisingly, Silas sat. The fight seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a weary, thrumming ache. Clara knelt in the dirt beside him. She gently took his left hand. The skin was a landscape of trauma, silver, puckered, and tight. She began to massage the salve into his forearm, her touch firm yet incredibly light. "My father used to say that wood remembers the wind," she whispered, her eyes focused on his arm. "And the body remembers the trauma. You have to remind the muscle that the fire is out, Silas." He was silent. His breathing, initially ragged, began to slow. The tension in his shoulders dissipated under her hands. He looked down at her, at this woman who was supposed to be a catastrophe, but who was currently the only source of mercy in his world. "Why are you really here, Clara?" His voice was low, stripped of its usual armor. "No one comes to Texas to disappear unless they've done something wrong, or unless someone's doing something wrong to them." Clara's heart skipped. She thought of the gold in the trunk. She thought of the wanted posters Elias had threatened to print. I'm here because I wanted to be someone's partner, not someone's property, she said. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. In Boston, I was just a ledger entry, a dowry, a means to an end. Here, even if I'm covered in ash, I'm real. Silas looked at his hand, now smelling of peppermint and willow. Real is a hard thing to be out here. It breaks most people. Then let it try to break me, she challenged, meeting his gaze. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a distant hoofbeat. Silas was on his feet in a second, his hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester leaning against the chimney. His transition from vulnerable to lethal was instantaneous. A rider appeared on the horizon, a man in a dusty duster riding a sturdy bay. It's Tom Henderson. Silas relaxed slightly, but his grip on the rifle didn't loosen. Neighbor from 3 miles west. He's a good man, but he's got a nose for news. Tom Henderson rode up to the ruins, his eyes widening as he saw Clara. He tipped his hat, a look of genuine shock on his face. Lord, Silas, the rumors in town were true. You actually got yourself a bride. I told Mary you were too ugly for the mail order business, but I guess I owe her a nickel. Silas didn't smile. She's here to work, Tom, not to listen to your jawing. What do you want? Tom's expression turned serious. Just checking on you after the fire, and to warn you. There's been a couple of strangers in town, well-dressed men asking about a woman from the east. Carrying a sketch, they were. Clara's blood turned to ice. She felt the weight of the trunk in the barn pressing against her mind. What kind of strangers? Silas asked, his icy eye flicking toward Clara. Lawyers, maybe, or manhunters. They were offering a handsome reward for any news of a missing heiress named Clara Thorne. The silence that followed was deafening. The windmill groaned in the distance. Silas turned his head slowly to look at Clara. Is that right? Silas asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. A missing heiress? And here I thought I just had a carpenter's daughter on my hands. Clara held his gaze, her chin tilted up, even as her pulse thundered. There are many things people say in town, Mr. Vance. Most of them are lies. Tom Henderson sensed the tension and cleared his throat. Anyway, Mary sent over some bread and a bit of salt pork. Figure you two could use a real meal. Welcome to Texas, ma'am. Hope you've got a thick skin. You're gonna need it. As Henderson rode away, Silas didn't move. He stood in the ruins of his home, the rifle in his hand, the scent of peppermint still on his skin. You got a lot of secrets in that trunk, don't you, Clara? Everyone has a past, Silas. I thought we were building a future. Hard to build a future when the past is riding up the trail with a bounty, Silas said. He turned and walked toward the barn, his limp more pronounced than before. Eat the bread. We start on the roof beams tomorrow. And Clara? She looked at him. If those men show up on my land, I don't care how much gold you're worth. I'll protect my own. But don't you ever lie to me again. Clara watched him go, the shadows of the ruins stretching out like long black fingers. She had the money to rebuild 10 homesteads, but as she stood alone in the dust, she realized that the one thing she couldn't buy was the thing she needed most: Silas Vance's trust. The tension between Silas and Clara over the next few days was as thick as the heat shimmer dancing off the Texas panhandle. Tom Henderson's warning about the well-dressed men with the sketch had planted a seed of suspicion in Silas that no amount of peppermint oil or hard work could weed out. He watched her constantly, how she moved, how she handled the tools, and how her eyes instinctively scanned the horizon every time the wind rattled a loose board in the barn. You're too quiet for a girl who's just looking to disappear, Silas remarked one afternoon as they struggled to hoist a crossbeam. His icy eye was fixed on her, searching for a crack in her resolve. And you're too observant for a man who claims he doesn't care about anyone, Clara countered, her voice tight. She wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of ash. Before Silas could respond, the sound of a carriage, not a rider, but a high-wheeled, expensive black buggy broke the silence. It was rolling up the dust-choked trail with an arrogance that only money could buy. Silas's hand went to the Winchester leaning against the foundation. "Stay behind the chimney," he ordered, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register. "I'm not a child, Silas." "I said stay back." The buggy pulled to a halt. A man stepped down, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than Silas's entire acreage. This was Julian Vane, the president of the Redemption Bank. He was a man with a smile like a razor blade, and eyes that saw only interest rates and foreclosures. Behind him sat two burly men in duster coats, their hands resting ominously on their holstered revolvers. "Silas Vance," Vane called out, flicking a speck of dust from his sleeve. "I see you're still playing house in the graveyard. I'd have thought a man of your limited faculties would have realized by now that the bank's patience is burned away along with that roof." Silas stepped forward, his limp pronounced but his stance steady. "The mortgage isn't due for another month, Vane." "Under normal circumstances, yes, but a burned homestead is a depreciated asset. High risk, Silas. I'm here to offer you a way out. Sign over the deed today and I'll give you $100 and a ticket to San Antonio. It's more than you're worth, given the state of your face." Silas's jaw tightened, the scar tissue on his cheek turning a jagged white. "Get off my land." Vane chuckled. Then his eyes drifted to Clara, who was stepping out from the shadow of the chimney. He let out a low, appreciative whistle. "And who is this? Don't tell me you found a woman desperate enough to share a barn with a monster. She looks far too refined for this filth." Vane walked toward her, his gaze lingering on the curve of her throat. "Tell me, darling, does he pay you? Or do you just have a fetish for tragedy? Because I could offer you a much softer bed in town." Silas moved, but Vane's hired men were faster, drawing their revolvers and leveling them at Silas's chest. "Steady, Vance," one of them growled. Clara felt a cold, familiar rage boiling in her blood. This was the same oily arrogance Elias had used. She didn't retreat. Instead, she walked calmly toward Silas's gun rack near the salvage pile. "Mr. Vane, I believe my husband told you to leave," Clara said, her voice like silk over steel. Vane laughed. "And what are you going to do, little girl? Throw a tea saucer at me?" Clara didn't answer with words. In one fluid, practiced motion, a skill learned in the secret hunting lodges of the Thorne estate while her father was alive, she snatched Silas's spare Colt Peacemaker from the rack. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. Crack, crack, crack. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. The first shot took the cigar right out of Vane's hand. The second shot shattered the glass lantern on the side of his buggy. The third shot nicked the heel of Vane's expensive boot. The hired men froze, their mouths agape. They hadn't even seen her cock the hammer. "The next one goes between your eyes, Mr. Vane," Clara said, the pistol steady in her hand, her gaze unfaltering. "I was raised by a man who valued marksmanship over manners. I suggest you take your buggy and your depreciated assets back to town before I decide to see if you're as empty-headed as you look." Vane was pale, his hands shaking as he looked at his ruined cigar. You crazy bitch. Vance, you're dead. You hear me? The bank will have this land by Friday." "Friday is a long way off," Silas said, a ghost of a grin touching his scarred mouth. "And my wife has a very short fuse. Move." Vane scrambled back into the buggy, his men following suit. They turned the carriage so hard it nearly tipped, disappearing in a cloud of vengeful dust. Silas turned to Clara, his icy eye wide with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. "A carpenter's daughter, you said?" Clara lowered the hammer of the Colt and set it back on the rack. Her hands were perfectly still. "My father was many things, Silas. A carpenter, a hunter, and a man who knew that a woman in a world of wolves needed to know how to bite." Silas looked at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Who are you really running from, Clara? Because a woman who shoots like that isn't running from a broken heart. She's running from a war. Maybe, Clara whispered. But for now, I'm just a woman who wants to finish the roof before the sky falls. The sky falling happened sooner than either of them expected. By Wednesday, the temperature had been a sweltering 80 degrees, the air thick and stagnant. But by mid-afternoon, the wind shifted. It didn't just blow. It roared from the north, a wall of bruising blue-black clouds sweeping across the plains like the end of days. "Blue norther!" Silas yelled over the sudden howl. "Get the tools! Get into the barn!" In Texas, a blue norther could drop the temperature 40 degrees in an hour. By the time they barred the heavy barn doors, the air was already crystalline with frost. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, and the temperature inside the barn plummeted toward freezing. They were trapped. Clara huddled near the small potbelly stove in the tack room. But the thin walls offered little protection. Outside, the world was a whiteout of sleet and frozen dust. Silas was silent, sitting on a crate near the door. He was wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, but Clara could see he was shaking. His left side, the side claimed by the fire, was reacting to the sudden brutal cold. The scar tissue, deprived of blood flow, was contracting, pulling his muscles into agonizing knots. "Silas, I'm fine," he gritted out, his teeth chattering. "Go to sleep, Clara." "Don't lie to me, not after today." She walked over to him. His face was ashen, the silver puckers of his scars standing out in stark relief against his skin. He was clutching his left arm as if trying to keep it from shattering. "The cold, it's like the fire started all over again," he whispered, his pride finally failing under the weight of the pain. "The nerves, they don't know the difference." Clara didn't hesitate. She dragged him toward the stove. She took her own heavy wool blankets and wrapped them around him, but it wasn't enough. The heat from the stove was too shallow. "Look at me, Silas." She sat on the floor between his knees. She took his left hand, the clawed, scarred fingers, and pulled them toward her chest. She didn't recoil. She didn't look away. "Touch is the only thing that calms the nerves," she said softly. She began to rub his hand, her own fingers warm from the stove. Then she reached up, her palm cupping his scarred cheek. It was the first time she had touched the most damaged part of him with such intentionality. Silas stiffened, a low groan escaping him. "Clara, don't. It's monstrous." "It's not monstrous, Silas. It's a map of your courage. You saved those horses. You saved yourself. There is no shame in a body that fought to stay alive." She began to massage the tight cords of muscle in his neck and jaw, her touch firm and rhythmic. Slowly, incredibly, the tremors in his body began to subside. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing, a long, shaky breath escaping him. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, the armor was gone. He wasn't the scarred cowboy or the bitter widower. He was just a man in pain, and she was the only mercy he had. "Why are you so good to me?" he whispered into the darkness of the barn. "I've given you nothing but grief and ash." "Because I know what it's like to be judged by what people see on the surface," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "In Boston, I was just a dollar sign, a prize to be won. No one cared about the woman underneath. You saw me. You saw the dirt and the work and the shooting. You're the first person who ever looked at me and saw a partner." She was so close to telling him then. She wanted to tell him about the $40,000. She wanted to tell him that Julian Vane could never take this land because she could buy the bank 10 times over. But as Silas reached out his good hand and tentatively touched her hair, his thumb brushing her temple with a reverence that made her heart ache, she realized the truth was a double-edged sword. If she told him now, would he see her as a savior? Or would he see the money as just another wall between them? "I'm glad you stayed, Clara," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep and the lingering hum of her touch. I'm not going anywhere, Silas. Not even when the past catches up. The blue norther howled outside, a frozen beast clawing at the walls. But inside the barn, wrapped in the scent of cedar and old wool, the fire was finally out. For one night, the secrets were buried under the snow, and the only thing that mattered was the heat of two souls refusing to break. The week following the blue norther was a fever dream of productivity. The shared vulnerability of that frozen night had acted like a weld, fusing Silas and Clara into a singular rhythmic unit. They finished the rafters by Tuesday. By Thursday, they were laying the cedar shingles Clara had purchased from a passing freighter. The cabin was no longer a skeleton. It was a home, smelling of fresh-cut wood and the promise of sanctuary. But the air in Redemption was turning foul. On Friday morning, as Clara was stirring a pot of beans, 3 riders appeared on the ridge. They weren't like Julian Vane's hired thugs. These men wore long, dusty dusters and carried themselves with the cold, calculated precision of professional manhunters. They didn't approach the homestead. They sat on their horses, watching, silhouetted against the harsh Texas sun like vultures waiting for a heartbeat to stop. "They're back," Silas muttered, his hand tightening on the grip of his hammer. "The men with the sketch." Clara's heart did a slow, sickening roll in her chest. "Silas." "Don't," he said, his voice hard. "Whatever ghost you're running from, it's found its way to my porch. I'm going into town to settle things with Vane. If he's talking to these men, I need to know why." "Silas, wait." But he was already saddling the bay. "Stay in the house, Clara. Bar the door. If anyone who isn't me tries to cross that fence, use that peacemaker. You hear me?" She watched him ride away, the dust from his horse's hooves clouding the air. She knew what was coming. Vane wasn't just talking to the hunters. He was the one who had cleared the path for them. 2 hours later, the riders moved. They descended from the ridge with the slow, inevitable momentum of a landslide. But they weren't headed for the house. They were headed for town. Clara knew she had a choice. She could stay hidden, let Silas fight a battle he couldn't win, and watch Julian Vane seize the land while the hunters seized her. Or she could burn the bridge behind her. She went to the barn. She pulled the trunk out from under the hay. Her fingers trembled as she found the catch and lifted the false bottom. The gold certificates, $40,000 of Thorn blood money, glimmered in the dim light. "I'm sorry, Silas," she whispered, "but I won't let you die for my sins." The Redemption Bank was a temple of polished mahogany and cold intent. Silas Vance stood before Julian Vane's desk, his hat in his hand, his scarred face a mask of weary defiance. "I have half the payment, Vane," Silas said. "The rest in 3 weeks, as agreed." Vane leaned back, a sneer twisting his lips. "I'm afraid the terms have changed, Vance. I've had an inquiry. Very prestigious people from the East. It seems your wife is a thief of a very high order, a fugitive from justice. This property is now under a legal freeze." "She isn't a thief," Silas growled, leaning over the desk. "She's my wife." "She's a prize, Silas, and you're just the dirt holding her. Boys, show Mr. Vance the door." The 2 men from the ridge stepped into the office, their hands on their holstered Navy Colts. Silas braced himself, the fire in his ice-blue eye ignited. He was ready to die on this mahogany floor if it meant keeping his land. "That won't be necessary," a voice rang out from the doorway. Clara stood there, her canvas work trousers stained with ash, but her chin held high with the regal authority of a queen. In her hand, she held a thick, wax-sealed envelope. She walked past the hunters, past the shocked whispers of the townspeople, and threw the envelope onto Vane's desk. "That is $4,200 in Treasury notes," Clara said, her voice echoing through the bank. "The full mortgage of the Vance homestead plus a 15% premium for administrative inconveniences. I expect the deed to be cleared and signed within 10 minutes." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian Vane stared at the money, as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Silas, however, wasn't looking at the money. He was looking at Clara. The ice in his eye had turned to glass, shattered and sharp. 10 minutes, Julian, Clara repeated, her gaze never wavering. Or I walk across the street to the telegraph office and contact the State Banking Commission regarding your predatory lending practices. I believe they would be very interested in your legal freeze. Vane's face turned a mottled purple, but he snatched the money. The deed was signed with a trembling hand. Clara turned to Silas, hope fluttering in her chest like a wounded bird. It's over, Silas. The land is ours. Vane can't touch us. Silas didn't move. He looked at the deed, then at the dirt on her hands, then back at the envelope. Ours, he whispered, the word sounding like a curse. He walked out of the bank. He didn't wait for her. He didn't look back. Clara followed him into the street, her heart sinking with every step. Silas! Silas, listen to me! He stopped near the hitching post, turning to her with a look of such profound betrayal that it made her knees buckle. Was it funny, Clara? He asked, his voice low and vibrating with pain. Watching me sell my tools, watching me kill my last horse, watching me crawl to Vane for an extension, while you had $40,000 hidden in a trunk? I was trying to protect us. My cousin Elias. If I used that money, he would find me. And he found you anyway, Silas spat. But you let me believe we were partners. You let me believe we were building something from the dirt up. But it was all a lie. I wasn't a partner. I was a prop in your play. Silas, no. You didn't trust me, he said, the ice in his eye turning to tears he refused to shed. You sat there in that barn, watching me break my back, and you didn't trust me with the truth. You thought I'd want you for the money. You thought I was just another Vane. I was afraid. We were all afraid, Clara. But I gave you everything. I gave you my name, my ruins, and my scars. You gave me a forged story and a chest full of blood money. He untied his horse. The house is yours. You paid for it. Every board, every nail. I hope it's enough to keep you warm, because I'm done living in a lie. He swung into the saddle and rode toward the mountains, leaving her standing in the dust of redemption, the deed to a kingdom clutched in her hand, and a hole in her soul that no amount of gold could fill. The house was finished, and it was a tomb. For 3 days, Clara lived in the structure they had built. She had bought a real stove, a mahogany table, and fine wool blankets from town. She had the luxury she had run from, and it tasted like ash in her mouth. Every time she looked at the fireplace, she saw Silas numbering the stones. Every time she touched the doorframe, she felt his calloused hands over hers. The silence of the plains was no longer peaceful. It was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. She slept in the house, but she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. On the 4th day, the sky didn't turn blue. It stayed a sickly, bruised yellow. The wind died down completely, leaving a stillness that felt like a held breath. Clara was in the kitchen when she smelled it. Not the acrid scent of the old fire, but the sharp, aggressive stench of kerosene. She ran to the window. A carriage sat near the gate. Not a buggy, but a high-end black brougham. Standing in the middle of the yard was a man she hadn't seen in 2 years, yet whose face haunted every nightmare. Elias Thorne. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, looking entirely out of place in the Texas dust. In his hand he held a silver-headed cane. Behind him, 4 men stood with torches, the flames licking hungrily at the dry air. "Clara, darling," Elias called out, his voice smooth as honey and twice as sickly. "You really should have chosen a more hospitable climate. The dust is terrible for your complexion." Clara stepped onto the porch, her peacemaker held steady in her hand. "Get off this land, Elias. The mortgage is paid. I am a married woman. You have no claim here." Elias laughed, a dry, rattling sound. A married woman? To a scarred peasant who's currently drowning his sorrows in a bottle of cheap rye in a mountain shack? I think not. As for the claim, I don't want the land, Clara. I want the money. And I want the Thorn name cleansed of your indiscretions. I'll kill you before I let you touch that trunk, Clara said, her finger tightening on the trigger. Oh, I'm sure you would. But you see, I'm not interested in the ruse anymore. Boys? Before Clara could react, one of the men threw a torch. It didn't hit the house. It hit the barn. The old cedar caught instantly. The kerosene had been applied liberally. In seconds, the structure where she and Silas had first slept, where they had shared their first quiet moments of mercy, was a pillar of fire. The ruffian loves his barn, doesn't he? Elias sneered. I wonder if he'll come running when he sees the smoke. Or perhaps I'll just burn the house next with you inside it. You monster! I'm a businessman, Clara, and business is very, very bad. Elias signaled his men. They began to circle the house, torches raised. Clara fired a shot, clipping the shoulder of one man, but they were fast. Tell me where the remainder of the inheritance is, Clara. I know there is more. The certificates you used at the bank were barely a fraction. Clara looked at the barn. The heat was immense, the light blinding. She thought of Silas's face, the scars he had earned saving horses in a fire just like this one. She realized then that Elias wasn't just here for the money. He was here to destroy everything that was real about her. The money is in the canyon, Elias, she lied, her voice cracking. In the old buffalo wallow. I buried it there when I heard you were in town. Lying until the end, Elias sighed. Burn it all. As the torches flew toward the house, Clara didn't retreat. She ran, not into the house, but toward the ridge. She had to lead them away. She had to make sure that even if the house burned, Silas would have a reason to come back. She had to be the decoy. She disappeared into the brush, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the roar of the flames behind her. Elias and his men followed, their greed a scent they couldn't ignore. Far off in the mountains, a man sitting by a cold campfire looked toward the horizon. He saw a thin, black ribbon of smoke rising against the yellow sky. It was coming from the direction of the Homestead. Silas Vance didn't think about betrayal. He didn't think about the gold certificates. He only thought about the woman who had kissed his scars in the dark. He swung onto his horse and rode like the wind, his heart a hammer against the anvil of his ribs. The wind didn't just blow through the canyon of Devil's Throat. It screamed, a high, thin wail that echoed off the jagged limestone walls like the ghosts of the buffalo that had once been driven over its edges. Clara Thorne rode the spare sorrel mare until the animal's flanks were lathered in white foam, a thick, salty lather that mirrored the desperation in her own heart. Her lungs burned with the fine, alkaline dust of the West Texas Badlands, a grit that seemed to settle into the very marrow of her bones. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against her scorched canvas sleeves, the remnants of the fire at the homestead still clinging to her skin in the form of soot, and a lingering metallic scent of disaster. But inside, amidst the external chaos, Clara felt a strange, cold clarity. The fear that had haunted her from the cobblestones of Boston to the dust of redemption, the fear of being found, the fear of being owned, had finally distilled into a singular, razor-sharp purpose. She wasn't running to save her life anymore. She was riding to bury a curse that had been sewn into her inheritance like a poisoned thread. "Faster, girl," she whispered, leaning low over the mare's neck, her fingers entwined in the coarse mane. "Just a little further. We don't stop until the past is ash." She led her pursuers deep into the labyrinth of red rock and scrub cedar. This was a terrain Silas Vance had mapped for her during their long, arduous days of labor. He had spoken of the killing floors, where the earth was still dark with the memory of ancient blood, and the narrow chutes where the wind played tricks on the human ear, turning a simple whisper into a terrifying roar. She knew the hunters behind her, Elias and his 3 hired guns, were men of the city. They saw only the heat and the unbearable dust. They saw a woman they thought they knew, a fragile, thorn socialite lost in a wasteland. They didn't see the trap until the walls of the buffalo wallow began to close in around them. The rhythmic thunder of 4 horses grew louder, the sound vibrating through the canyon floor and rattling the stones at the base of the cliffs. Clara reached the wallow, a natural sun-cracked amphitheater rimmed by steep, unclimbable walls of crumbling limestone. She dismounted with a jarring thud, her knees buckling for a moment before she forced herself upright. With a sharp, stinging slap to the mare's flank, she sent the animal galloping toward the far exit, disappearing into a thick cloud of dust. Then she stood alone. She was the center of the world's most expensive target. She opened the heavy leather satchel. Inside, the gold certificates lay in neat, bundled stacks, crisp and white against the red dirt. $40,000. It was a king's ransom. It was enough to buy a dozen ranches, enough to live a life of gilded luxury in Europe, and enough to destroy every honest, hard-earned thing she had built with Silas Vance. To her, in the white-hot glare of the Texas sun, they no longer looked like currency. They looked like the heavy iron shackles of a life she had outgrown. "Clara!" Elias Thorne's voice broke against the canyon walls, high-pitched and frantic. He appeared at the entrance of the wallow, his silver-headed cane trembling in a hand that had never known a day of real work. Behind him, the 3 manhunters sat on their horses, their long dusters coated in a thick layer of red grime, their eyes fixed on the satchel at her feet with a predatory hunger. Elias dismounted, his expensive navy suit a ruined mockery in the Texas heat. He stumbled toward her, his face a mask of sweating greed and misplaced entitlement. "Don't be a fool, Clara. You're cornered. Hand over the satchel and I'll tell the marshals you were coerced. I'll give you a small allowance, enough for a quiet life in a cottage somewhere far from here. Just give me what is mine." Clara stepped into the center of the clearing, the peacemaker heavy and steady in her hand. Her sapphire silk dress was a ghost of a past life. Now she was clad in trousers stained with the ash of a burned barn and a shirt dampened by the sweat of a woman who had learned the value of a roof she had helped frame. She looked at Elias, at the man who had tried to steal her agency, her fortune, and her soul, and she felt nothing but an icy, distant pity. "I stopped being a seamstress the moment I laid the first stone of Silas's house, Elias," she said, her voice cutting through the wailing wind like a whetted blade. "And I stopped being your prey the moment I chose a man with scars over a man with a title. You think this paper makes you powerful? It only makes you a slave." She kicked the satchel open. The bundles of treasury notes spilled out onto the cracked, thirsty earth. Elias let out a strangled gasp, lunging forward like a starved animal, but Clara fired a shot into the dirt inches from his feet. The report of the pistol was deafening in the confined space of the canyon, a thunderclap that silenced even the wind. "One more step, Elias, and I'll do what I should have done back in Boston," she warned, the barrel of the peacemaker unmoving. "You haven't the stomach for it." Elias spat, his eyes darting frantically between her and the money. "You're a thorn. You were built for drawing rooms, for tea services, for lace and politeness. You aren't built for blood and dirt." "I was a thorn," Clara countered, her finger tightening on the trigger, the metal warm against her skin. "Now I'm the wife of a man who fought a fire with his bare hands just to save creatures that couldn't even thank him. I've learned that some things, the things built on lies and stolen labor, are worth burning." With a swift, practiced motion, she pulled a match from her pocket and struck it against the dry limestone. The flame flickered, a tiny, lethal spark against the vast, unforgiving canyon. "The certificates, Elias," she said, her eyes as cold as a mountain spring in winter. "Or the fire. Choose now." "No, you wouldn't. That's a fortune. It's our entire legacy. It's everything we are." Elias shrieked, his voice breaking into a sob of pure avarice. "It's a curse," Clara said. She dropped the match. The oilcloth lining of the satchel caught instantly. The wind, trapped in the bowl of the wallow, acted like a massive bellows, turning the small spark into a roaring inferno in seconds. The paper, The promises of power, the certificates of status curled and blackened, the ink vanishing into a column of thick, black smoke. Elias screamed, a sound of pure mercenary agony, and lunged toward the flames, trying to snatch the burning bundles with his bare hands. His hired men moved to help him, their greed overriding their survival instinct. They were so focused on the burning gold that they didn't hear the jingle of spurs at the canyon's rim. They didn't see the 5 men appearing on the ridge, the sun reflecting off the silver stars pinned to their dusters. Crack! A rifle shot rang out from above, hitting the ground inches from Elias's reaching fingers. "U.S. Marshals, hands in the air, Thorne, every one of you, or we open fire." Clara fell back against the limestone wall, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline began to drain away. She watched as the marshals descended the steep rocky trail, their weapons trained on the soot-covered defeated men. She had telegraphed them from the town of Redemption 2 days ago, using the very money she hated as bait to lure Elias into a trap that spanned 3 states. She had sacrificed her anonymity, her fortune, and the last shred of her family's dignity to ensure that Silas Vance's land and his heart would never be a target again. As Elias was dragged away, weeping and cursing her name, Clara looked at the satchel. The gold was turning to gray flakes, drifting away on the Texas wind. She was penniless. She was a fugitive whose face would be on every wanted poster by Monday. And as the marshals led the horses out of the canyon, she felt, for the first time in her life, truly and completely free. She didn't know if Silas was even alive, or if he would ever look at her without seeing the shadow of her lies, but as the smoke cleared, she felt the first breath of a future she had actually earned. The rain didn't just fall that night, it wept. It was a slow, cleansing drench that soaked into the parched blood memory of the earth and smelled of ozone, wet cedar, and the promise of a long-delayed spring. It washed the soot from the leaves and the bitterness from the air, a silent benediction over a land that had seen too much fire. Silas Vance rode onto his property as the dawn began to gray the eastern horizon. He had ridden through the night, his body a map of exhaustion, his mind a storm of regret and a hollow, aching hope. He expected to find a blackened square of earth where the cabin had stood. He expected the fire of Clara's past to have finished the work the lightning had started, leaving him with nothing but the scorched remains of his second attempt at a life. But as he crested the final ridge, he pulled the reins so hard the bay mare reared back, its hooves pawing at the mud. The house was standing. The barn was a pile of smoldering charcoal, a skeletal ruin that hissed under the light rain. But the cabin, the one they had framed together, the one where he had held her hand over a spirit level and taught her the weight of a hammer, was untouched. It rose from the mud like a fortress of fresh, pale cedar, its windows reflecting the bruised purple of the morning sky. He dismounted, his limp heavier than usual, his heart a hammer against the anvil of his ribs. He walked through the open front door, the scent of fresh wood and wet earth greeting him like a ghost. Clara? The silence was deafening. The house was empty, devoid of the vibrant life she brought to every room. The mahogany table he had helped her move was covered in a fine layer of soot carried in by the wind, but it stood solid, a witness to their shared labor. He walked to the bedroom, his eyes searching for the heavy leather trunk. He found it in the corner, the lid thrown wide, as if it had nothing more to hide from the world. He reached inside, expecting to find the empty space where the gold had been, a void that represented her departure. The false bottom was gone, pulled away to reveal the raw cedar beneath. But as he dug through the remaining scraps of fabric and lace, the remnants of her Boston life, his hand hit a bundle wrapped in heavy waterproof oilskin. It wasn't money. It wasn't gold. He opened it with trembling, soot-stained fingers. Inside were the letters from his brother Caleb, the ones Silas thought had burned in the first fire. There were the tintypes of his mother, her face faded but her eyes clear and kind. There was the deed to the land, signed, cleared, and legitimate. And there was a small, handwritten note on a scrap of ledger paper. "I couldn't save the barn, Silas, but I saved the heart of this place. I'm sorry I didn't trust the man as much as I trusted the ghost of my fears. The money is gone. I've given it back to the fire so it can never hurt us again. I'm going to the Valley of the Bluebonnets to wait for the reckoning. Do what you must. I will be there." A sob broke in Silas's throat. A jagged, raw sound he hadn't made since the night the fire took his family and his face. She hadn't taken the gold and fled to a softer life. She had chosen his memories. She had chosen the things that couldn't be replaced by a bank certificate or a king's fortune. She had chosen him. The valley was 3 miles south, a hidden basin where the spring rain had worked a miracle overnight, bringing the bluebonnets out in a sea of sapphire that rivaled the silk dress she had worn on the day they met. The fragrance was overwhelming, sweet and thick, a carpet of blue stretching as far as the eye could see. Silas found her sitting on a limestone outcrop, her back to him, her silhouette small and defiant against the vastness of the Texas sky. She was wearing her canvas work trousers, her shirt torn at the shoulder, her hair a wild chestnut tangle that caught the morning light. He dismounted and walked toward her, the jingle of his spurs cutting through the quiet. She stiffened, her shoulders rising, but she didn't turn around. She looked like she was prepared for a sentence, not a greeting. "The marshals took Elias," she said, her voice thin and weary, carried by the breeze. "They'll be looking for me next. I telegraphed them, Silas. I gave them my real name. I'm a thorn, and I'm a fugitive. I've brought nothing but smoke and lawmen to your door. I understand if you want me to leave." "I don't care about the lawmen, Clara," Silas said, his voice husky with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. She finally turned. Her face was smeared with ash and dirt, her eyes red from the smoke and the wind and the tears she had shed in the dark. "The money is gone, Silas. Every single cent. I burned it in the buffalo wallow to make sure Elias followed the greed instead of the house. I have nothing to give you now. No lumber, no windows, no dowry to make up for my face or my past. I am just a woman with a hammer and a broken name." Silas stepped closer, his icy blue eye fixed on her with a heat that had nothing to do with fire, and everything to do with a man who had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found his home. "You think I want the windows, Clara?" he asked. He knelt in the dirt and the bluebonnets before her, oblivious to the damp earth. He took her hand, the one that had held the match, the one that was blistered and raw from the fight. "I found the letters. I found the tintypes. I found the deed." "They were all you had left of your past," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Silas said, pressing her hand against his scarred cheek, letting her feel the heat of his skin and the sincerity of his soul. "You're what I have left of my future. You're what I chose when I followed you into the smoke. I lied to you, Silas. For months I let you believe I was someone else. I let you break your back while I sat on a fortune." "And I judged you," he countered. "I let my pride tell me that a man's worth is only in his calluses. I didn't see that you were fighting a war I couldn't understand, a war of the spirit. You didn't give me a handout, Clara. You gave me a home. And then you burned a fortune to protect the man inside it. That is the only dowry I ever needed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, plain silver band. It was his mother's, salvaged from the ruins weeks ago, and polished until it shone like the moon. "I don't have $40,000, he said, his voice vibrating with a rugged, honest love. "I've got a smoldering barn, a debt of gratitude to the Hendersons, and a face that still catches the light wrong in the mirror. But I've got a house with a roof that doesn't leak, and a heart that has no interest in beating without you. Silas, Clara Thorne, or whatever name you want to carry into tomorrow, will you stay? Not as a bride who was bought with a letter, and not as a partner who was tested by fire, but as the woman who saw a man in the ruins and stayed until the embers were cold." Clara looked at him, at the scars that were no longer a map of tragedy, but a map of survival and resilience. She looked at the silver ring, then at the vast, blooming valley. "I'm done running, Silas," she said, her voice finally finding the steel she had forged in the fire. "I choose the man. I choose the homestead. I choose you." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A circle of silver against a hand that knew the weight of a hammer and the heat of a match. He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of rain and cedar and the end of a very long, very cold winter. Around them, the bluebonnets swayed in the spring breeze, a sea of sapphire that no longer looked like a costume for a lady, but like a harvest for a pioneer. The homestead wasn't just a house anymore. It was a fortress built on the only currency that never devalues: the truth, spoken in the ruins and kept in the heart. The days following the return from the Buffalo Wallow were a strange, quiet blur of reconstruction and legal reckoning. Marshal Miller and his men lingered in the town of Redemption for a week, sifting through the evidence Clara provided and taking Elias Thorne back east in chains. The town, which had once whispered about the scarred Vance and his mysterious bride, now looked upon the homestead with a mixture of awe and respect. Clara spent most of her mornings at the sheriff's office, providing the testimony that would finally clear her name. It turned out that Elias's web of lies was thin. Once a federal authority looked into the Thorne estate's books, the truth of his embezzlement and his framing of Clara fell apart like wet paper. By Wednesday, a telegram arrived from Boston. Clara Thorne was no longer a fugitive. She was a woman of standing, her family's legacy restored, though the physical wealth she had burned was gone forever. "You don't look like a woman who just inherited a clean name," Silas noted as he helped her down from the bay mare on Thursday evening. Clara smiled, the lines of tension around her eyes finally beginning to fade. "A name is just a collection of letters, Silas. The standing I care about is right here, on this porch." They spent that afternoon not in a bank or a lawyer's office, but in the mud of the barn site. The neighborhood had turned out, the Hendersons, the Pattersons, even the men who had once looked askance at Silas's scars. A barn raising was a sacred tradition in the West, a communal act of defiance against the harshness of the land. "On three," Tom Henderson's voice boomed. Silas and a dozen other men heaved. The first great oak beam, timber Silas had spent his secret savings on and Clara had helped prep, swung into place. It was a massive, sturdy thing. Together, they weren't just rebuilding a structure. They were building a life that didn't depend on hidden gold. As the sun set, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of amber and gold, the frame of the barn stood tall against the horizon. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow, his scarred hand resting comfortably on Clara's shoulder. There was no shame in his posture now, no need to hide the left side of his face from the world. He was a man who had been chosen in the fire, and that knowledge had tempered him into something unbreakable. "We'll need a proper garden come spring," Silas said, looking at the land. "And more livestock, maybe some Appaloosas. Caleb always wanted to breed them." "We'll build it all," Clara agreed. "But first, I think we have an appointment at the church." The wedding was a small, dusty affair on a Saturday afternoon. There were no silk gowns or mahogany pews. Clara wore a simple dress of pale yellow cotton she had sewn herself, and Silas wore a suit that smelled of cedar and starch. They stood before the preacher, not as strangers bound by a proxy contract, but as two people who had seen the worst of each other and decided it was enough. When Silas spoke his vows, his voice didn't shake. He looked at Clara, not at the heiress or the fugitive, but at the woman who had held a hammer and a match for him. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from the Henderson children outside the church were louder than any Boston cathedral choir. That night, they sat on the porch of the finished cabin. The smell of fresh cedar was sweet in the air. The stars were so bright they felt close enough to touch. "I realized something today," Clara whispered, leaning her head against Silas's chest. "What's that?" "My aunt's will said I should build something meaningful. I thought that meant a clinic or a library. I thought it meant something I could pay for." She reached out, tracing the grain of the porch railing. "But the most meaningful thing I've built is the trust I have in you, and the house we built with our hands." Silas kissed the top of her head. "The money was a ghost, Clara. It kept you running. I'm glad you laid it to rest." West Texas, 1890. The sea of sapphire had returned. The valley was once again drowning in bluebonnets, a vibrant, swaying carpet that stretched toward the rolling hills. From the porch of the Vance homestead, the view was vastly different than it had been 7 years prior. The cabin had grown. A sturdy addition had been added to the north side to accommodate a growing family. The barn was the pride of the county, filled with the Appaloosas Silas had spent years breeding. And further down the trail, near the edge of town, the white-painted walls of the Vance Medical Clinic gleamed in the sunlight. Clara had fulfilled her aunt's legacy after all. Over the years, she had used her legal expertise and what remained of the Thorne name to secure funding for the clinic, a place where doctors were paid in trade and no child went untreated. A young boy, no more than 6, came sprinting through the bluebonnets, his laughter carrying on the breeze. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin. Behind him, a smaller girl in a pinafore struggled to keep up, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "Pa! Pa! The mare is foaling!" the boy shouted. Silas stepped out of the barn, his limp barely noticeable now, his face weathered by the sun but peaceful. He scooped the boy up, laughing as he swung him around. Silas's scars were still there, but to his children, they were just part of him, as natural as the grain in the wood or the stars in the sky. Clara joined them, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She looked at her husband, the man who had once told her she was a catastrophe he couldn't afford. "Go on," she urged Silas with a smile. "The boy's been waiting for this foal since winter." Silas set the boy down and looked at Clara. The look in his icy blue eye hadn't changed. It still held the same fierce, honest heat that had saved her in the buffalo wallow. He walked over to her, his hand cupping her cheek, the hand that had built a life from ash. "I'll be back for dinner," he promised. "Make sure there's enough for Tom and Mary. They're coming over to talk about the harvest." "Always is," Clara said. She watched them head toward the barn, her husband and her son, the past and the future walking side by side. She looked at the stone chimney, the original heart of the homestead that had survived the lightning and the torches. It stood as a silent witness to everything they had endured. She realized then that the mail-order bride hadn't just found a home. She had found a purpose. The fire hadn't taken everything. It had simply burned away the things that didn't matter, leaving behind a foundation of truth. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and bluebonnets across the plains. Clara took a deep breath, her hand resting on the silver ring that had never left her finger. She wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she chose to be. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.